Hi, this is Rick from Edwardle Software, and this video is part of the training series for Poker Odds Calculator Pro. And in this video, I'm going to specifically talk about the hand rank breakdown, and I'll show you that real quick here. So now this hand, I'm just going to have two players, a 7-8 hearts versus two random player, to calculate the odds here. And now if you click this blue button here, it dies down and gives you the detailed stats for that player. And here you can actually see this is the hand rank breakdown. This is what we're going to discuss in this video in detail. But if you swipe, you can actually see the equity heat chart here. And also from this screen, you can switch players by touching the arrows here. So you can drop down to the second player. So this is the second player, the random cards. And here's the equity heat chart for the two random cards. So those are the two main stats. And also if you had calculate to flop, the other stat, which I'm not going to go into detail, is you have the standard hand rank breakdown, but you also have the draws breakdown along with the equity heat chart. So those are the three detailed stats. In this one, I'm going to discuss, of course, the hand rank breakdown. So here I have 7-8 of hearts, which shows a 48% equity against a random player. But if you click here, now I can see the actually hand rank breakdown for that player from high card all the way up to straight flush. And these are the actual percentages for each of them are actually in the numbers are here. And the number always corresponds to the total bar here, all the colors added together. So for example, this two pair shows 21.8%. And that's the sum of blue, orange, and white. And then basically the blue is win times the percentage when the player won the hand. Orange is when the player tied the hand, and white is when the player lost the hand. So that shows that the player is going to end up with two pair 21.8% of the time, and majority of that time he'll win with the hand, and a little bit of the time he'll tie with two pair, and then maybe it looks like a third of the time he'll lose with the two pair. So that's what the blue, orange, and white does. But to keep in mind that 21.8% is the sum of whatever you see here, because you can actually turn off the colors. You can turn off scenarios. So let's say you want to see the two pair hands that the player won. And then you can just go down here and turn off the loss, touch the loss, and tie. And now it only shows the blue, and it shows 12.9%, which is win, just the blue here. So 12.9% of the time, the player will have two pair and win the hand. And compare that to, if you turn these back on, 21.8% of the time, he'll have two pair. And sometimes he wins, sometimes he ties, and sometimes he loses. So that's what these buttons down here give you. They give you the flexibility to find more information and turn off scenarios. For example, you might want to wonder, how often do I tie with two pair? You can turn off the loss and win. And now you're looking at the little orange slices and showing 1.5% of the time I'll tie with two pair. Or you can look at the total, 4.5% of the time I'm going to tie total. So that's what these the first row of these buttons down here do. Now I'm going to talk about the diving down to find out more details. Like for example, I just talked about two pair, but we can actually dive in and not just look at two pair, but we can look at the specifics two pairs. For example, any row where you have this circle with the little arrow, you can touch that row. Now it dives down and gives you even more statistics just about the two pair alone. So, for example, this ranges from 3s and 2s all the way up to aces up. Now, all the rows on the bottom from this row all the way up to the aces up, those numbers always sum up to the top row. So 28.8% of the time has two pair, but all the rows below it is basically the breakdown of the 21.8%. And that makes sense because these are all the possible to pair. And what's actually is interesting is uh, you can actually pinch these to make them bigger. Because so now you can actually quickly look and see what stands out. And what stands out to me is the aces up and sevens up. They happen a lot more often than any other two pair. And it's eights up happening the most often. And that makes sense because the player has a 7 and an 8. So you can look at, but then the eights up alone, you're thinking, oh, good, I flop, or I'll hit a two pair eights up 7.7% of the time. And now a lot of people are assuming when you say that, you actually have two pair eights and sevens. But this eights up actually includes other two pair, and you can actually click on the eights up to actually see the breakdown of those. So what you were actually thinking before, let's pinch and zoom again. What you're thinking before, that two pair eights and sevens, that only happens 4.8% of the time. The other two pair, eights and sixes, eights and fives, eights and fours, eights and threes, and eights and twos, those happen roughly 0.5% each. So that actually adds up to become a big part of the 7.7%. So what you were thinking before, 7.7%, is actually the more valuable number is 4.8%. And you only could see that if you could actually dive in. And that's what you can do. So here it shows 4.8% of the time he'll have two pair where the two pair is eights and sevens. And you can actually, again, since even in the dive down stats, you can turn off the wins or losses to look at just the wins, 3.8%, and so forth, just like that. So it's a very powerful feature. And actually, the diving down and diving up is, I haven't seen it anywhere else yet. Perhaps there are other apps or programs for other, maybe PC or Mac programs that does this, but I haven't seen it myself. So actually, this is a good spot. Let's pinch and zoom here again. So now this is still a good spot to talk about this bottom row, these buttons down here. Now, like I said before, this row, the win, losses, and ties are basically toggles of turning on and off scenarios, turning off the wins, turning off the losses, turning off the ties, and so forth. While the bottom is very similar, these are also scenarios too. But these don't deal with wins, losses, and ties. These deal with what cards the player will use in the hand eventually. So if you're more worried about actually using both of your cards, that's this button here. So you can actually, if you say I turn off the 7, I turn off the 8, and I turn off the board. All right. So now it's actually showing only the hands that both cards were played. In other words, the 8s and 7s, that's obviously he's using both cards here, 8 and 7. But here, the 8s and 6s means he used the 8 and he uses the 6s, but he actually used the 7 for the kicker because you have the 7, 8 are both are played. And to compare that, let's compare that with there. It went from 0.57 down to 0.08. So what that means is most of the time when you have the two pair 8s and 6s, the 7 doesn't play. Most of the time you end up playing a kicker that's on the board. So that's interesting concept. Next, actually just dive back to the home screen and examine this a little bit further. So here you can actually, if you turn off the first three buttons, now what it's showing is times you play the board only. Basically, showing you all the hands in which these two cards aren't played. Like, for example, if the board comes like a 5 spades, giving the player a flush of spades, then these 7 of hearts, he's playing the board basically, so the 7 of hearts aren't played. Or if the board comes ace, 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 king, king, meaning that player has aces full of kings and not playing the 7 or the 8. In other words, he's playing the board. Another example, let's say the board comes ace, ace, 2, 2, 10, giving the player aces over 2 pair aces and tens, aces and 2s with a 10 kicker. That's what I said, yeah. So that means the 7 and 8 are still haven't been played. He's still playing the board, and that's another scenario for playing the board. So if you look at the stats, what this is a 5.2% means when I'm turned off all these buttons down here. That means 5.2% of the time that player is playing the board. And you can actually look at the other stats. For example, if he has a pair, he'll hit a pair 2.4%, but still play the board, which is pretty rare. And another interesting note is, see how it's all orange and white, and even if you turn off the win here, the numbers don't change. Oh, why is that? Well, that's because you're playing the board. There's no possible way to win the entire pot against any player if you're playing the board, so that makes sense. So those two are actually more easy to understand, the board and the 7 and 8. That means when you're playing both cards or you're playing no cards. But what does the other two mean? Well, the seven of hearts means I'm just playing the 7 and I'm not playing the 8. And the 8 of hearts is vice versa. I'm just playing the 8 of hearts and I'm not playing the 7. So the bottom row actually encapsulates all the possibilities. Playing both cards, just playing the 7 of hearts, just playing the 8 of hearts, or playing neither of the cards. So for example, if you just playing the 7, let's just playing the 7 of hearts, let's just turn to that, a lot of stuff dropped out. First of all, the quads, the only way you can get quads is if, in this example, if you have, is with a 7 is, only way to get quads with just the 7 alone is having quad 7s. Let's look at the full houses. Notice the full houses, they all have a 7 in it because I must play a 7. And notice also all the full houses don't have an 8 in it because I'm not playing the 8. And you go into 7's full, and they're all 7s. Look, notice there's no 7 fulls of 8. That's because I have the 8 turned off. So actually, if I turn on this right now, the 7, 7, 7, 8, 8 appears. That's because I have the 7 only turned on, which is all these other hands. But I also have both on, 7 and the 8, which is encapsulated in there. And if I turned on the 8 of hearts, let's see what this 7's full does. I have to go back one level. Now I have 8's full, where I have all these 8's full possibility because I have all these combinations turned on. So let's say what if I turned off this button here, the 7, 8 of hearts? What do you think happens on this screen? Well, if I touch this button here, then that turns off all hands where I play both of the cards. So which hands here play both of the cards? Well, that's this row here, 8, 8, 8, 7, 7. So if I touch here and here, so there is a possibility to have 8, 8, 7, 7, however, still only playing one card. How is that possible? Well, that comes when you have, let's say, an 8, 8 here, but you also have a 7, 7 here with some other cards. So 8, 8, 7, 7, and let's say a king. So if it comes 8, 8, 7, 7 with a king, that gives you 8's full of 7s. However, the 7 here doesn't really play because you already have the pair of 7s on the board. So basically, the pair of 7s on the board counterfeited your 7, so any other 8 would actually split with your hand, and that's why this value still shows up. However, it shows up a very, very small percentage of the time. If you turn on this again, the 0.02% raises to 0.42%. So that's the difference. See that? It changes. So the buttons on the bottom are actually probably the most confusing aspect of this hand rank breakdown. And for the most part, you don't really have to touch it. You can just leave them all on. However, let's say you turn them all off. Well, what happens is you just filtered out all the data, so you have to turn some of them on. Let's say you turned off all these off. Well, you just filtered out all the data again. So on most point, you can just keep all these on and just explore all the stats in general. But if you want to more information about how many players, how many cards the player uses, you can use these buttons down here. It helps you out. It gives you a lot more details. And this can also be applied to random cards or a hand range. They're both applied similarly, but instead of actually having specific cards here, you have if the player plays both cards, if the player plays a single card, or if the player plays the board. So a random player against 7-8 of hearts will end up playing the board 5.5% of the time. Or let's just look at both cards. He uses both cards 47.2% of the time, and the player uses one card, just the one card, 47.9% of the time. So that's kind of interesting. It's almost like a 50-50 between using both cards and one card with 5% left over for playing the board. So that just goes over the power of this hand rank breakdown. And it works, of course, with random cards. It works with known cards. It also works with, let's actually put some board cards up here. Yeah. Actually also works with single cards. So if you just have 10 with the random card, and you go here, so now it actually works with 10 and random card. And if you go down to trip 10s here, it shows you that I'll have trip 10s, which is actually a good chance because you already have a pair of 10s. 8.7% of the time you have trip 10s, and you'll normally, most of the time, will play a higher kicker than your 9, but 2.7% of the time ends up being the kicker if you have 3 of a kind. I'm just doing some examples. Let's go back to this other player, the 7-8s. Here you can notice some of the stats pop up to the top. So the only way he's going to possibly get a 4 of a kind if he has 4 of kind 7. So that stat just hopped to the front because there's no other 4 of a kinds. And the trip 7s pop to the front because there's no other way to get 3 of a kind besides trip 7s. Because if you get any other 3 of a kind, then you'll have a full house. And similarly, if the pair of 7s pop to the front, because that's the only way you can have a pair, if you have a pair of 7s. Let's click on there. That's kind of interesting. Now notice the pair of 7s is always white here, and you can actually verify that by turning off win and tie. Yep, they're all white. So basically, he always loses with a pair of 7s. So he's going to have to improve. Why does he always lose with a pair of 7s? Well, it's simple, because he's up against a pair of 10s at least, because the other player already has a pair of 10s. So the pair of 7s is always a loser. But here you can see the breakdown of the kickers. Pair of 7 with the ace, all the way down to pair of 7s with a 10, meaning these cards would be lower than a 10. Well, there you have it. That's the hand rank breakdown. If you have any questions, you can always email me at support@edwardle.com or visit the website edwardle.com. And also check out the other training videos for Poker Odds Calculator Pro. Thank you.